It happened in the quiet outskirts of West Creek, a small town tucked deep in the flatlands of North Carolina. The year was 2017, and winter had arrived without snow, just an endless stretch of wet days and bitter wind. The kind of cold that didn't sting but settled slowly into bones, into sidewalks, into the cracks of empty buildings. It made the world look quieter, like it had been placed under glass. Most trees were bare, and the sky hovered low, a faded gray that refused to lift. James, a 52-year-old mailman, was on his regular route along the industrial edge of town. His delivery bag hung heavy against his side, straps biting into his coat. This part of the route had long stopped expecting letters. Warehouses, chain-link fences, and rusted garages lined both sides of the road like ghosts of usefulness. Most structures were locked, boarded, or simply abandoned. Mailboxes stood out front like hollow promises, their lids rusted open to the elements. James didn't stop often here. He drove slower than usual, more from habit than hope. As he turned onto a narrow crossroad where the cracked pavement faded into loose gravel, he pulled over to adjust the strap of his bag. His fingers were stiff from the cold, fumbling with the buckle. It was then he noticed the movement, barely a flicker, by a rusted dumpster at the corner of a dilapidated lot. A small puppy emerged from the shadows. Its coat was reddish, with dark-tipped ears and a body so thin the outline of its ribs showed through the fur. Its legs were too long for its frame, clumsy, yet practiced. There was something urgent about the way it moved, quick, deliberate, but not panicked. In its mouth it held a crumpled paper bag, grease-stained and torn. The faint scent of fried food lingered in the air as the wind shifted. James didn't move. He simply watched, still half-crouched by his vehicle, as the puppy darted away from the dumpster. It didn't pause to eat or scavenge. It didn't even seem to notice him. Instead, it clutched the bag tightly and sprinted toward the gap between two buildings, disappearing through a narrow space where the bricks had cracked and sagged. Within seconds it was gone, swallowed by the stillness of the empty street. There was no sound left but the breeze nudging a broken sign on a nearby gas station, its plastic panels clacking faintly with each gust. James stood there a moment longer, bag half adjusted, the cold pressing in again. He glanced toward the alley the puppy had vanished into, but there was nothing now. Just wind and silence. The next day, James returned to the same lonely crossroads. The morning was colder than the last, with a low fog creeping along the ground, clinging to the edges of buildings like it belonged there. He parked his truck a little farther back this time, out of direct sight, then approached quietly on foot. With careful movements, he unwrapped his lunch, a simple sandwich, and placed it on the cracked stone windowsill of a crumbling brick structure nearby. It faced the same alley the puppy had vanished into the day before. Once the sandwich was set, he turned and walked back to his truck, pretending to drive away. But he didn't leave. He circled the block and parked behind an old warehouse, engine off, waiting in the silence. Minutes passed. Then, from the same narrow alley, the reddish puppy emerged again. Its steps were cautious but determined. It moved with the same urgency as before, its eyes scanning the space before it. It didn't go near the sandwich. Instead, it sniffed the air briefly, retrieved a paper bag from behind the dumpster, likely one it had stashed earlier, and without hesitation, it vanished again into the shadows between the walls, the sandwich untouched. James didn't follow immediately. Something about the routine struck him. Too purposeful, too measured. This wasn't survival scavenging. This was something else. Later that evening, just before dusk, he returned in his old pickup, headlights off, letting the truck coast to a quiet stop behind a row of derelict garages. The light was fading fast, and the cold had begun to settle again, heavier with the onset of night. He stepped out and waited near a broken fence, hidden by the skeletal outline of a half-collapsed billboard. In the pale orange wash of a flickering street lamp, he saw the puppy again. This time, it moved slower, carrying what looked like torn food wrappers and crusts of bread in its mouth. The grease-stained paper trailed slightly in the wind, catching the lamplight as it flapped against the ground. The puppy paused briefly near the dumpster, then turned down a different alley, slipping through a gap in a chain-link fence. James followed, his steps careful and measured on the cracked pavement. He moved past stacks of wooden pallets, abandoned tires, and a burned-out car frame. The sounds of the town had faded behind him. No more passing cars or distant dogs barking. Only the hush of wind through broken things. Beyond the fence, behind a wall of discarded lumber and plastic sheeting, James finally saw them. 3 more puppies, huddled together beneath the overhang of a half-collapsed loading dock. One was black, its front leg wrapped in what looked like a piece of old fabric knotted crudely. Another was pale gray, almost white, shivering visibly even from a distance. The third was brown, with a slight curve in its back, as if it had been struck and never healed properly. None of them barked or moved toward the food. They waited in silence, eyes following the red puppy as he approached and gently placed the food between them. He didn't eat. He didn't push his way in. Instead, he stepped back, settled nearby, and watched. It was then James saw the full shape of it all. The reddish one was starving too, its limbs too thin, its fur dull and patchy. But it had chosen to bring what little it found to those who couldn't. In a forgotten pocket of a forgotten town, a small animal had created something like a family and given up his own comfort to keep them alive. James stood there, unseen, as the wind stirred the plastic sheeting and the last light left the alley. He didn't move, afraid that any sound would collapse the fragile world he had just discovered. From that evening on, James returned every night. The cold had settled deeper into the town, and the wind had begun to carry a sharper edge. Each time he brought warm food packed in simple containers, soft rice, boiled chicken, pieces of potato. He left the meals in the same quiet corner near the fence where the red puppy had last appeared, then stepped back, blending into the shadows to watch from a distance. The red puppy was always the first to emerge. He moved slowly, ears up, nose to the air, scanning the surroundings with deliberate caution. Only after a long pause, when he was sure the area was safe, did the others follow. One by one, they came limping or trembling from the ruins behind the loading dock, their bodies thinner now, but their movements steadier with each meal. Nearly a month passed in this routine. James marked the passing days by the deepening cold, the frost edging the corners of his truck windshield, and the slower movements of the pups. He noticed how the red one had become leaner, despite the food, how his steps were heavier, his posture more fatigued. Yet he never ate first. He would sniff the food, step aside, and only return once the others had eaten their fill. Even then he picked at the scraps, as if any satisfaction for himself had to come second to theirs. One night, seeing the temperature dropping sharply, James brought more than food. In the back of his truck, he'd packed an old cardboard box, sturdy and wide. Inside, he layered pieces of a worn flannel blanket, soft and faded with age. He placed it near the same fence where he left the food, pressing it gently into the corner, out of the wind. Then, as always, he backed away and waited. By morning, the box was empty. No paw prints in the frost, no sign of use. But James knew better than to expect results quickly. That evening, he returned and parked further down the alley, behind an abandoned delivery truck with a clear view of the box. He stayed low, breath fogging in the air, and waited. It wasn't long before he saw movement. The red puppy appeared first, as always, and approached the box cautiously. He circled it once, sniffed at the corners, then stood still, listening. Moments later, the others emerged from the shadows, drawn to the promise of shelter more than food. One by one, they crawled into the box, curling into themselves, forming a tangled knot of fur and ribs and quiet breath. But the red puppy didn't go in. Instead, he laid down just outside the opening, resting his head on his paws, facing outward like a silent sentinel. His eyes stayed open long after the others had stilled. His breathing was labored, visible in the cold air. His body shook with small, involuntary tremors, and yet he didn't move closer to the warmth. He remained at the entrance, exposed, as though his role wasn't to rest, but to guard what he had kept alive. James watched from the shadows, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was seeing. The red one was more than a puppy. He was a caretaker, a protector. Even with ribs pressing through skin and exhaustion hanging from every limb, he never broke the pattern. He continued to bring scraps, bits of bread, wrappers with remnants of meat, whatever he could find, and placed them gently near the others before backing away. He remained near but apart. There was something sacred in the simplicity of it, something that didn't belong to instinct alone. It was choice, quiet, unflinching sacrifice, the kind that didn't need recognition to be real. James sat there for a long time, the night deepening around him, the breath of the sleeping pups rising from the box in small, rhythmic clouds, and outside it, the red one still watched. James made the call on a Thursday afternoon, his fingers stiff from cold as he dialed the number. The woman who answered was Lauren, a longtime volunteer at the local animal shelter, and someone who had once treated his old cat when no one else would. Her voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice shaped by years of experience with loss and hope side by side. She agreed to come. By the next evening, they met behind the warehouse with supplies in hand and quiet understanding between them. They set up a large, humane trap, a sturdy metal cage with an open door and a blanket covering part of the frame to make it feel less threatening. Inside, they placed a bowl of warm food, soft rice and shredded chicken, steam rising into the cold air like a silent invitation. Then they stepped away, positioning themselves far enough to go unseen, but close enough to act quickly. The red puppy came first, as expected. His movements were careful but sure. He approached the trap, sniffed around the edges, then stepped inside, not for the food, but as if to inspect it. He didn't eat. He simply turned around once, looked toward the dark corner where the others waited, and laid down inside the crate. Within minutes, the other three followed. It was almost as if they had been waiting for his signal, his silent permission. They entered the cage one by one, drawn not by the food, but by the presence of the one who had always led them. Lauren stepped forward slowly, hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. When she closed the door and secured the latch, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her tears were not born of pity, but of something deeper, a raw, exhausted kind of gratitude. Gratitude that they were still alive. Gratitude that someone had cared enough to try. The shelter stood on the edge of town, a weathered building with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but inside it was warm. Volunteers moved quietly, each with practiced hands and soft expressions. The pups were brought in and gently separated for examination. Blankets were laid out. Water bowls refreshed. Notes were taken. They were given names. The smallest one, white and trembling, was named Willow. The black one with the bandaged leg became Finn. The curved back pup was called Leo, and the red one, he was named Rusty. Rusty remained distant for the first few days. Though the warmth of the shelter was real, though the bowls of food were always full and the bedding soft, he held back. He watched as the others began to eat with less fear. He observed every medical check, every bandage change, every hand that reached out. Only when the others had finished their meals did he approach the bowl left for him. Even then, he ate slowly, methodically, as though unsure he was allowed. His body remained thin. His eyes stayed alert. He never slept deeply. The veterinarians diagnosed him with early-stage pneumonia and moderate malnutrition. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious. His breathing was labored, his muscles stiff. Yet he never cried out, never whimpered, never resisted. He endured treatment with silent resolve, his body trembling only when the others were out of sight. It wasn't until the 5th night that something shifted. James had come to visit, bringing the same flannel blanket he once left in the box. It smelled of the cold nights and the familiar air they had once breathed together. The moment Rusty saw it, he laid down, not on the blanket, but beside Willow and Finn, curling his body gently against theirs. His eyes closed, not from exhaustion, but from something gentler. Release. For the first time, he slept without facing the door, without placing himself between danger and the others. He had watched long enough. Now, at last, he rested. 2 months passed beneath the quiet rhythm of winter fading into early spring. The days grew longer, and the wind that once clawed through the shelter's windows began to soften. In that time, the 3 smaller puppies found homes of their own. Willow went first, adopted by a young couple who ran a small farm outside of town. They sent photos of her bounding through fields, ears flopping wildly, and sleeping beside chickens as if she had always belonged there. Finn was chosen by a woman raising 2 children on her own. She wrote letters filled with drawings from her kids, stories of how he slept at the foot of their bunk beds and barked gently whenever someone cried. Leo went to a retired man who had lost his wife the year before. He called Leo his quiet company, a presence that made the silence in his house feel full instead of empty. Each family kept in touch with the shelter. They sent updates, photos, small details that showed how the pups were growing, not just in size but in comfort. Their eyes had changed, their bodies stronger, their movements more relaxed. The shelter walls that had once echoed with their cautious steps now felt just a little quieter. Rusty remained. He had grown healthier. His coat had thickened, his breathing eased, and his weight had finally settled. But his spirit still lingered on the edge of something unresolved. Visitors came often, kind people, families with soft hands and patient smiles. They sat beside his kennel, offered toys, called softly. Rusty never growled or cowered. He simply didn't respond. He watched, but didn't move, listened, but didn't engage. Lauren noticed it too. She said it felt like he wasn't waiting for a home. He was waiting for the others. As if part of him had stayed behind when each pup left, and now there was no place he could enter without feeling incomplete. His loyalty wasn't tethered to one person or one place. It stretched across the quiet connection he had built in the cold, when survival depended on something wordless and shared. Even James began to wonder if Rusty's story was already complete. Not in the traditional sense of adoption, but in the quiet fulfillment of purpose. Maybe his role had never been to be rescued, but to rescue. And now that it was done, he didn't know what to be. Then, one morning, an email arrived at the shelter, then another, and then a third. All 3 families, unaware of each other's intentions, had reached out within days. Each of them had mentioned Rusty. Each of them had expressed the same quiet ache, that something was missing, that their homes had become fuller, warmer, but not whole. Separately, they had come to the same conclusion. They wanted him. Together. One family offered their fenced yard and a warm doghouse, a space where Rusty could come and go freely. The second promised to bring food, handle vet care, and check in weekly. The third asked if they could take him every other weekend, just to give him a place to rest beside them, to share time and familiarity. It wasn't a plan. It was a gesture. Something real, born not of convenience but of instinct, of kindness that doesn't ask for definition. When Lauren read the emails, she didn't hesitate. She printed each one and taped them to the shelter's corkboard, side by side like puzzle pieces that had finally found their edges. Rusty didn't choose a home that day. A home chose him. One made not of walls, but of people who had seen what he had done, what he had given, and wanted to give something back. And for the first time since arriving at the shelter, when James leaned into his kennel and opened the door, Rusty stood up before being asked. Spring arrived quietly in West Creek. The trees took their time, hesitant to believe the cold had truly passed. Buds formed cautiously along branches, testing the air before opening. The ground stayed damp for weeks, saturated with thawed memories and the scent of new beginnings. Children's voices slowly returned to the sidewalks, bouncing between houses like kites tugged by wind. The town, as if stretching after a long sleep, exhaled softly. Rusty lay on the wooden porch of the house that now belonged to more than one family. The boards were warm beneath him, touched by the sun for the first time in months. The sounds of morning drifted around him, laughter from inside, the rhythmic scrape of a rake across soil, a bicycle wheel clicking faintly down the street. He was older now, heavier in frame, softer in the eyes. His body bore the strength of recovery, but his gaze still carried the stillness of those long, cold nights behind the fence. When the boy approached the gate, Rusty raised his head. The boy belonged to one of the homes, one of the families who had taken in Willow or Leo or Finn. His presence was familiar, not in name, but in rhythm. Rusty stood slowly, his legs steady, his chest broad with calm breath. He walked down the steps and crossed the yard, not quickly, but with certainty. He paused near the boy, sniffing the air, then leaned in, pressing his nose gently to the small open hand that reached toward him. The touch was brief, instinctive. Afterward, Rusty circled once and laid down beside the boy's feet, not in submission, not in need, but simply as a statement. He was there. He had chosen to be. The boy sat down, his knees pulling to his chest, and for a long moment, they shared the kind of silence that speaks louder than noise. Behind Rusty was a history: broken concrete, torn wrappers, cardboard boxes, and nights filled with hunger he had never let win. Ahead of him was nothing certain, no promised future, no perfect plan. But there was this moment, and the quiet peace that came with it. Rusty had become more than a rescued dog. He had become a quiet part of the landscape, a constant in a changing town. He no longer needed to check for danger before resting. He no longer stood between others and the cold. He simply belonged. Not because he had been claimed, but because he had stayed. He had stayed through the fear, through the waiting, through the silent promises made by shared breath and watchful eyes. He had given the best of himself when he had almost nothing. And now, without asking, he had been given something rare: quiet, enduring love. Not for what he had done, not for what he could offer, but for the simplest truth, that he was there when it mattered. And sometimes, that is everything.